Her brother-in-law gave her land because he expected the mountain to finish what he started. That was the only way to make sense of it afterward, the speed of it, the quiet of it, the way Roland Holt moved through the legal machinery of Harlow's Crossing in the week after Edgar's burial, as though he had been rehearsing the motions for years. No shouting, no courthouse drama, just signatures on documents most people in town had never been asked to read a handshake with the bank manager on a Tuesday morning before the coffee had cooled. And by Thursday, the sawmill that Edgar Holt had built from $40 and 2 decades of stubborn work belonged entirely to Roland, along with the logging accounts, the timber contracts, the house on the east side of Harlow's Crossing, where Addie had lived for 6 years, and every stick of furniture inside it. Wyoming Territory moved fast in the autumn of 1886. Faster than grief, faster than a widow with no children could move through paperwork she had never been shown before. The land Addie received, if received was even the right word for what Roland slid across the table toward her during that final meeting in the lawyer's office, was 40 acres on Cutter's Ridge, which sat at the upper end of the Absaroka foothills north of town. The deed was old enough that the ink had faded along one edge, the name on it crossed out twice before Edgar's name appeared. A trapper named Cutter had filed the original claim in 1871. Nobody in Harlow's Crossing knew exactly what had happened to him. They only knew he had not survived his first winter on that ridge, and that nobody had tried to winter there since. Roland had not offered the land out of guilt. Roland Holt was not a man who experienced guilt in any form that produced useful behavior. He offered it because it was the one piece of Edgar's estate with no practical value, 40 acres of granite and cedar scrub at elevation land that would not hold a cabin long enough to matter in a territory where winter at that altitude had a way of resolving disputes that lawyers sometimes couldn't. Addie understood this. She was 38 years old. She had been understanding things men preferred she didn't notice, since she was 12 years old in a carpenter's house in Nebraska, watching her father build furniture that other men took credit for selling. She folded the deed. She put it in her coat pocket. She looked at Roland across the lawyer's desk, his hands flat on the wood. His expression, the careful blank of a man who has already moved on in his mind. And she did not say anything at all, because there was nothing to say that would change the arithmetic of the situation. And Addie Holt had never been interested in wasting words on arithmetic that was already settled. She walked back to the rented room above the dry goods store, sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and took the deed out again. Outside, the wind was coming down hard off the peaks. The kind of wind that made old men rub their knees and look north with the expression of people who had learned to read that particular sky. She thought about Thomas. Not the way she had been thinking about him since February, which was the sharp-edged grief that caught her mid-task, mid-sentence, mid-breath, arriving without warning when she smelled wood smoke or saw a particular angle of winter light. She thought about him the way she did when a problem needed solving, which was to ask herself what he would have noticed that she was missing. Thomas Holt had been a quiet man with good eyes. He noticed things other men walked past. He had noticed Addie in a church in Lincoln in 1870 when every other man in the room was watching her sister. He had noticed a weakness in the eastern wall of Edgar's sawmill 2 years before the timber shifted and would have brought the whole structure down. He had been dead since February from a fever that moved faster than any doctor in the territory could follow, and his absence still had a physical weight like a stone carried somewhere behind her sternum. She reached into the left coat pocket, the inside one that had been Thomas's, and her fingers found the folded square of cotton she kept there. One of his handkerchiefs plain white initialed TH in her own stitching from the winter of 1874. She had embroidered it badly. The letters uneven, the threads slightly too loose. Thomas had carried it every day for 12 years without ever mentioning the imperfect stitching, which she had always privately considered one of the better things about him. She held it in her palm for a moment. Not long. She was not a woman who permitted herself long moments of that particular kind. She put it back, stood up, looked at the deed. 40 acres on Cutter's Ridge. Land nobody wanted. Land a man had died on in 1871 without leaving a record of how. She pulled on her second coat and went downstairs to price canvas. The town of Harlow's Crossing sat in a shallow valley between the Absaroka foothills to the north and a long flat stretch of grazing land to the south that had been stripped of good grass 3 years running by cattle operations that moved on when the range gave out. What remained was a single commercial street, dry goods, a combined bank and law office, a feed supply building that smelled permanently of molasses, a small church, a sawmill that now belonged to Roland Holt, a hotel with 4 rooms above a dining room that served the same meal every day. Regardless of what you ordered in a barber shop, the barber used mainly as a place to receive news before distributing it. It was not a prosperous town. It was the kind of town that existed because the land around it required certain services, and there was not yet a better place to get them within a half-day's ride. The woman behind the counter at the dry goods store, whose name was Nell Pryor, looked at the items. Addie set down canvas, a hand axe, 2 wool blankets, a coil of rawhide cord, a tin of sulfur matches wrapped in oilcloth, and did not ask any questions. Nell Pryor had been watching situations resolve themselves in Harlow's Crossing for 22 years, which had given her a particular respect for women who did not explain their plans out loud. The total came to $3.80. Addie had $4.15. She paid, gathered the supplies into the canvas, tied the bundle with rawhide. On her way out, she bought a strip of salt bacon and a small sack of dried beans from the barrel by the door. Nell Pryor did not charge her for the beans. Addie noticed. She didn't say anything. Both women understood the transaction completely. The road north out of Harlow's Crossing climbed steadily for the first 2 miles, following a creek that ran clear and fast in summer, but had already begun to ice along the edges in the October cold. The wagon wheels found every frozen rut and hit them all with indifferent force. The horse, a short, broad animal the livery owner called Mose, moved at a pace suggesting he had developed opinions about this part of the foothills. Above the creek crossing, the road narrowed and the angle increased. The air thinned enough that Addie felt it in her chest. The aspens had already turned and dropped, leaving white trunks standing bare against the dark slope. Higher up, where granite pushed through the soil in long gray shelves, the trees changed character entirely. Cedar and tamarack, still but different, not the straight-reaching trees of lower elevations. These had been shaped by decades of wind coming off the high passes, and they had responded not by dying, but by changing the terms of their survival. They grew low, they grew twisted, they grew into and through each other, limbs weaving together until no single trunk carried the load alone. The whole canopy distributed across the whole structure, each tree leaning on the next, none of them upright, all of them present. The first time Addie really looked at them, not glanced, but looked, she felt something shift in the way she was understanding the problem she was riding toward. Nothing on this ridge stood straight for long. That was not failure. That was instruction. She rounded the last bend and found them waiting, which she had expected. Roland had sources of information throughout Harlow's Crossing. The way a spider had threads, he didn't need to watch every corner himself, because something was always watching for him. He had come up the ridge road ahead of her and brought Cade Pruitt with him. Cade Pruitt was Roland's logging foreman, a broad-framed man in his middle 40s who had spent most of his adult life cutting timber in the Northern Territories and carried the particular physical confidence of someone who had worked dangerous outdoor work for a long time without being killed by it. He stood beside Roland's wagon with his arms crossed, the expression of a man attending an event he expected to be brief. Roland climbed down when Addie pulled up. His boots found the frozen mud, and he stood in it without visible discomfort, the way a man stood on ground he considered his, regardless of whose name appeared on what document. He was 5 years older than Thomas, would have been heavier through the shoulders. With the same pale eyes their father had passed to both sons, and the particular set to his jaw that Addie had learned in 6 years to read, as meaning he had already made his decision and was now performing the courtesy of the conversation. $35. His voice was level, not unkind exactly. I'll add a train ticket south. There's warehouse work in Cheyenne. I can arrange a letter. Cade Pruitt looked past Addie toward the upper ridge and gave a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. First wet snow will put you under up there. That's not me being hard. That's what happens. The wind chose that moment to come down through the granite cuts above them, not pushing so much as finding every gap in clothing and exploiting it. Addie felt it move through her collar. The horse shifted its weight. She looked at Roland, not at Cade. Roland was the one whose answer mattered, the one whose answer she was refusing. No. One word, flat as the frozen mud under his boots. No heat in it, no tremor, nothing that offered a handhold for negotiation. Roland looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalculating, not persuading. His jaw shifted slightly. Then he looked past her at the upper ridge, the rock, the bent cedar, the early snow still caught in shaded crevices even in October, and something in his face settled into the stillness of a man deciding to let the landscape make his argument for him. "Father left you this land," he said quieter now, "because he didn't know what else to do with it." A pause. "Not because it was worth anything." He climbed back into his wagon. Cade Pruitt gave the ridge one last professional look, the assessing eye of a man who had seen what winter did to construction, then followed. The wagon sounds faded down the slope. Wind filled the space they left. Addie sat with the reins in her hands, listening to the silence that wasn't quite silence. Cedar branches moving overhead, the creak sound below, the high whistle of wind through granite. Then she clicked her tongue at Mose, and the wagon moved forward upward into the part of the ridge where the trees stopped trying to be trees and became something else entirely. She found the first campsite by eliminating what wouldn't work. The exposed granite shelf near the top was too open. The hollow below the cliff face trapped cold air in a way she could feel against her ankles when she walked through it, temperature dropping by something measurable within 10 feet. The small flat area near the northern edge caught wind from two directions simultaneously. What remained was a stand of old cedar on the western slope below the main ridgeline, where the trees had grown together over decades into a canopy so dense and low that Addie had to duck to move beneath it. She stood inside it and listened to the difference. Outside wind, persistent cutting. Inside, almost nothing. The air barely moved. Not warm, she was not going to fool herself with that word, but less in the specific way that closed spaces are less than open ground in January. The mountain was not offering shelter. It was demonstrating that shelter existed within certain parameters if she was willing to work inside those parameters rather than against them. She unhitched Mose, tied him to the most substantial cedar trunk, unloaded the supplies, made camp. The first fire took 3 attempts. When it finally held, she crouched over it with her palms out, letting heat work into her knuckles, which had gone white on the long drive up. The canvas went between 2 trunks as a windbreak. The blankets went on a bed of broken cedar boughs she cut with the hand axe. She ate cold salt bacon and drank water from the canteen she had kept inside her coat to stop it from freezing. Around midnight, the temperature dropped hard enough that the mud along the wagon tracks cracked audibly. She added wood rolled closer to the coals, pulled both blankets up, lay watching the fire through half-closed eyes while the wind moved through the upper branches with a sound she would later think of as the mountain running its hands along every edge to find what was loose. Nothing in the cedar stand was loose. The branches wove into each other at a dozen angles, distributing the pressure of the wind through the whole interlocked structure so no single point failed. The canopy bowed. It did not break. She noticed that. Even half asleep, she noticed. Morning came gray and thin, the light arriving without warmth. Addie rose before full light banked the fire's remnants, stood at the edge of the cedar canopy, looking at the 40 acres she technically owned. What she needed to understand before she picked up the axe, before she dug a single hole, was what the land already knew. Her father had taught her this about wood. You looked at the grain before you put the saw to it, because the grain told you where the wood wanted to go. She was standing on 40 acres of mountainside that had been working out how to survive at this elevation for several thousand years longer than she had been alive. The least she could do was spend a few days listening before she started arguing. She walked the ridge, not quickly, not with purpose in the conventional sense. She moved the way Thomas had moved through problems he was thinking through, covering ground, slowly stopping, often crouching sometimes, to look at things at ground level. She had brought ash from the dead fire in a small tin. At intervals, the top of the ridge, the eastern slope, the flat shelf near the granite outcropping, the edge of the cedar stand. She tipped a small amount of ash into the air and watched. At the top of the ridge, the ash scattered instantly in every direction. Too exposed. On the eastern slope, it moved sideways in a single consistent direction. Channeled wind. Predictable force, but any structure would need to be designed around it. On the flat shelf near the granite, the ash rose slightly, then curled back on itself. An eddy current wind cycling off the rock face. Unpredictable was worse than strong. Near the cedar stand, the ash barely moved before settling. The wind that roared 30 feet overhead, arrived at ground level as a suggestion rather than a command. She spent the second day on the eastern edge of her 40 acres where the ridge broke into granite shelves, stepping down toward a frozen bog in the lower corner. The bog interested her not as a building site, but for what grew along its edges, moss thick and dark green, heaviest on the north-facing sides of the outcrops, where the wind struck least directly. Where there was less wind, there was more living moisture. The moss was marking the calmer air without being asked. She filed this. In the afternoon, she worked the western face, reading the drift pattern from the previous winter. Snow had left traces in the landscape, even in October. Compressed hollows where deep drifts had sat long enough to reshape the ground. Ice crystals still caught in the shadows of rock overhangs. Dead grass bent in specific directions, showing where the dominant wind had moved the snowpack across the slope. Nothing was random. The damage was organized. The drift lines told her where the mountain had been channeling snow for decades, which was the same as telling her where it would channel snow again. On the third afternoon, behind a low granite shoulder on the western slope below the main cedar stand, shielded from the eastern channel by the angle of the rock, she found the hollow. Not dramatic, not a cave, not a geological feature that announced itself. A shallow depression in the slope, perhaps 8 feet across the ground, slightly lower than the surrounding terrain, granite curving around it on 2 sides. The old snow impressions here were deep, far deeper than anywhere else on the 40 acres, showing accumulation that had been piling against the back of the granite shoulder for years each winter, burying the hollow completely. She stood in it and felt the air. Quieter. The granite shoulder was not tall enough to block significant wind. The effect came from geometry, the angle of the slope, the angle of the shoulder, and the position of the hollow, creating a relationship with the dominant wind current that caused the air to move over the hollow rather than through it. Self-shielding. The hollow protected itself. She crouched and pressed her bare fingers against the earth at the lowest point. Not warm, but less cold than the air above, by a measurable margin, the ground holding its own temperature distinct from the ambient, the way stone holds the temperature of its mass rather than the temperature of the air around it. She kept her fingers there, reading the specific quality of it. The stability. The mountain already started this shelter. Started it years ago. What remained was to finish it. That was the moment she heard him. Not footsteps. The frozen ground carried sound strangely. A creak of equipment, the soft sound of something moving through underbrush with long familiarity. Then the figure resolved out of the tree line to the north. A man well into his 60s with a line of steel traps hung over one shoulder, and the kind of face that outdoor decades produced seemed specific, the skin of someone who had been cold so many times it no longer registered as remarkable. He led a narrow sled. He moved with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who knew exactly where he was going. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at the hollow. He looked at her hand position her knees in the cold earth. He looked at the hollow again with the expression of a man reading something in a language he recognized, even if he hadn't expected to see it written here. Silas Morrow had been setting traps in the Absaroka foothills since before the territory had its current name. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. Addie had heard his name mentioned in Harlow's Crossing, the way certain individuals got mentioned when they'd been part of a landscape long enough to become part of the landscape. He stood with the trap line over his shoulder, looking at her in the hollow, his eyes doing the same kind of reading hers had been doing for 3 days. He didn't speak for a long moment. "Either you're figuring something out," he said finally, "or you already gave up and don't know it yet." Addie looked up at him. The light was going thin and gold in the way it went in October at elevation shadows starting to stretch across the slope. "Crow wintered on ridges like this," he said before she answered. Not a question, more like a piece of information set down near her in case it was useful. "Not this exact ridge, lower mostly, but they didn't fight the snowpack." A pause. "They used it." He moved to his sled without ceremony, reached under the canvas lashing, pulled out a short-handled shovel with a steel blade gone rust-brown at the edges, but solid at the socket, and a hand auger missing most of its crank handle with the bit intact. He set them on the frozen ground. Had these too long to carry weight that don't earn its keep. He looked at the cedar canopy above them, at the way the branches interlocked against the darkening sky. His eyes held the unhurried quality of a man who had read a great many landscapes over a great many seasons. Cedar bends better than pine under wet load. He picked up the trap line, adjusted its weight on his shoulder, moved on through the tree line to the north without looking back. The sled whispered behind him over frozen ground. Within a minute he was gone, and the only evidence of his visit was the shovel and the broken auger sitting beside the hollow. Addie looked at the tools. She looked at the hollow. She looked at the cedar canopy above the branches, woven through 40 years without breaking. She pulled out the deed, old paper, faded ink, the name Cutter crossed out twice before Edgar's name preceding hers. She read it once. 40 acres, Cutter's Ridge, Wyoming territory. She folded it along its original creases, put it back, picked up the shovel. The ground resisted immediately. Beneath thin topsoil lay shale in broken layers, each piece sharp enough to cut through worn glove leather, then the beginning of granite that rang like iron when the blade struck. But at the edge of the hollow where the slope met the back of the granite shoulder, the layering was different. More soil, more accumulated organic matter from the cedar stand above. The ground softer and darker with moisture that had been collecting there for years in that self-sheltered geometry. She dug until the light was fully gone, marking the edge of what she was starting, understanding its shape before she committed to it. Then she built a fire inside the hollow, the first fire in that specific place, probably in the history of that ground, and sat beside it with the shovel across her knees, eating the last of the salt bacon, while the flames lit the surrounding granite in orange and moving shadow. The wind moved over the hollow, the way it had moved over it for every winter, in that mountain's long, indifferent history over it, not through it. The fire bent slightly, not significantly. She was thinking about what Silas had said, not the part about the crow, though she would think about that more later, the part about cedar. She looked up at the canopy, at the branches woven together across 40 years of accumulated pressure, at the way none of them were straight, at the way they had grown into the problem, not away from it. Cedar bends better than pine under wet load. She had $4.15 when she left Harlow's Crossing, $3.80 of goods on her back, a shovel that wasn't hers, a broken auger, 40 acres of land a man had died on in 1871. Roland had 3 lawyers, the bank, the sawmill, the house where she had lived for 6 years, every timber contract in the county. She had the hollow, the granite shoulder, the cedar canopy above her. 3 days of reading the land before she put the first mark on it. The frontier never rewarded impatience. It rewarded the person who understood what was already there before they tried to add something new. She put another piece of cedar on the fire. The flames took it steadily. The work began with the roof, because without a roof, nothing else was possible. Addie spent the first morning of construction moving through the cedar stand above the hollow reading trees, the way her father had read lumber, not for what they were, but for what they could become under sustained pressure. She was looking for specific candidates, young cedars growing in clusters of 3 or 4 trunks. No thicker than her wrist root system, still shallow enough that the saplings hadn't fully committed to their current position. These she would not cut down. Cutting them down was the wrong instruction entirely. The lesson she had taken from 3 days of watching the older canopy was that the strength wasn't in individual pieces. It was in the connections between pieces, the way each element transferred load to the next, the whole structure behaving as a single flexible thing, rather than a collection of rigid parts trying to hold independently. She bent the first sapling inward toward the hollow, with both hands feeling where it wanted to resist feeling the grain of the young wood. Green wood in October still carried moisture, still had give. She curved it down across the space above the hollow, securing the tip to the granite shoulder with a loop of rawhide from the coils she'd brought from Harlow's Crossing. Then the next one. Then the next, weaving each new length through the ones already placed. Building a lattice with no clear beginning or end, each piece dependent on the others, no single strand carrying the load alone. The mountain disagreed with this approach almost immediately. A cedar branch she had bent too far from its natural grain cracked back without warning, the split end catching her across the left cheekbone, hard enough to open a thin line of skin below her eye. She stood still for a moment, with blood cooling on her face and her hand still holding the broken length. She looked at where the fracture had occurred, too far from the trunk, too sharp an angle, too much pressure concentrated at a single point rather than distributed along the curve. She noted this. She dropped the broken piece and found another. By the end of the third day of construction, her hands were damaged in a specific way, not the general soreness of heavy work, but the precise injury of cedar bark on skin-fine cuts along the base of her fingers where the rawhide had torqued under tension, split skin across her right palm where she had gripped a branch that moved faster than expected. She worked her hands open and closed over the fire each evening, feeling which motions pulled against damaged tissue, cataloging the information the way she cataloged everything up here as data that would reduce mistakes tomorrow. The first version of the roof failed in the night. She woke to rawhide snapping under tension, a series of small reports she felt in her chest before she fully understood them. Then a larger sound as a section of weave on the western edge collapsed inward, the whole link structure pulling loose from the anchor point on the granite shoulder where the rawhide had worked free in the cold. She lay in her blankets and listened to the cedar lengths settle against each other in the dark. In the morning, she looked at what had held and what hadn't. The sections closest to the living trunks where she had woven new lengths through the existing canopy rather than anchoring to static points had not moved. The wind that came through the night had distributed its force through the network of living wood above. The same way it always did, the same way it had always done on this ridge, and the parts of the new structure that participated in that network had moved with it rather than fighting it. The parts she had anchored to fixed points had taken concentrated force until the anchor failed. She rebuilt lower, denser, following the natural grain of the existing canopy rather than imposing a shape on top of it. 2 more days. Her cheekbone had closed and begun to crust. The cut on her palm had gone tight in the cold, and she wrapped it with a strip of cloth from the hem of her undershirt to keep it from cracking further when she gripped the rawhide. On the 6th day of construction, the first light snow came through early, more ice crystal than flake, the kind that arrived in October as a reminder rather than a threat. Addie stood in the hollow beneath the partially completed roof and watched it fall. The weave caught most of it. Not all, but most. The snow that came through the gaps landed on her coat sleeve in small, discrete pieces, not the diffuse powder that came through an open space. The lattice was doing something measurable. She did not press her hand to the earth again to confirm what she already knew from the cold against her knuckles and the steadiness of the air inside the partial enclosure. She had established that reading on the day she found the hollow. Now she was building toward it. 3 days later, snow dusted the completed canopy for the first time without falling through into the space below. She stood under it in the dim, cedar-filtered light and looked upward through the lattice. She thought of Thomas telling her once, after watching her spend an entire winter evening reworking a piece of embroidery she wasn't satisfied with, that the reason she was good at things was that she didn't confuse finishing with finishing correctly. She hadn't known what to say to that at the time. She hadn't known what to say to most of the accurate things Thomas said about her. She put the thought away and turned back to the walls. Digging into the slope below the hollow was different work, slower, more resistant, more personal in the way the mountain made resistance feel personal, as though directed at her specifically, rather than being the general indifferent hardness of granite-laced soil. Below the first foot of workable earth, the shovel hit shale in broken sheets, each piece lifting free at an angle that needed prying rather than scooping. Below the shale in places, solid granite that rang when the blade hit it and refused to move. She worked around the granite, defining the shelter's shape by what the ground permitted, rather than what she had initially planned, which produced a space longer along the slope than intended, but better positioned relative to what the ground below it was willing to offer. She discovered what the ground was willing to offer the way she had discovered everything on this ridge, by paying attention to what the material was telling her. At 3 feet down, the earth temperature changed. She could feel it on her bare hands in the afternoons, when the air warmed enough to make gloves more hindrance than help. The cold that existed at the surface, the ambient cold of late October Wyoming, did not extend uniformly downward. It lived in the top layer of soil in the frost that reached perhaps 18 inches, and then the earth below held a temperature of its own, a stable cold different in kind from the stabbing cold above. The difference between a deep lake in autumn and the air above it. She began to understand something about where to sleep. Cold air was heavy. Denser than warm, it sank to the lowest available point. She had noticed this in the cedar stand her first night, the coldest air at ground level, perceptibly less cold at shoulder height, even without a fire. The implication was specific and useful. She built the sleeping shelf 18 inches off the floor against the rear wall, raising it from the ground. Using flat shale pieces she levered free from the slope and stacked. The cold air could pool in the drainage channel she cut along the base of the forward wall. The sleeping shelf would sit in the band of air above it. She tested this with her hand at different heights from the floor, measuring the temperature gradient. The difference was real. The physics did not care whether she understood the vocabulary for it, it worked regardless. The retaining wall failed on the 14th morning. She had packed the western wall with loose earth from the excavation, pressing it in layers against the exposed shale face to hold back the slope. During a brief afternoon thaw, the temperature rising above freezing for 4 hours before dropping hard again at sunset, a section softened, lost cohesion, slid. Not catastrophic, not all at once, but enough that when she woke before dawn, the sleeping shelf was sitting in several inches of mud, and her blankets had absorbed cold water through the night without her noticing until she moved. She spent the morning with the broken auger shaft, using it as a scraper rather than a drill, moving mud out of the shelter in the cracked kettle she used for water. Cold, wet work with nothing interesting about it, nothing that taught her anything new, just the consequence of a mistake she now understood how to avoid. She cut drainage channels through the floor, angled and narrow, leading to a single exit point at the lowest corner, so that future infiltration would have somewhere to go that wasn't the sleeping shelf. When the channels were cut and the floor had drained as much as it was going to drain in that temperature, she sat back on her heels in the half-finished shelter and felt the particular quality of exhaustion that was different from tiredness, the kind that sat in the shoulders and behind the eyes, the kind she had seen her father carry home from the workshop on evenings when nothing had gone right and he had known it and kept working anyway. She ate the last of the dried beans cold from the pan. She looked at the drainage channels. They would work. On the 17th day, Roland returned. She heard the horses before she saw anyone sound carrying up through the bare October trees in the way sound moved on cold air. She was cutting sod from the frozen hillside above the cedar stand, sections large enough to be useful as roofing material when she heard it. She set down the shovel and waited. Roland came up the slope with Cade Pruitt on one side and Marshal Denton Ware on the other. The marshal was a tall man with a careful face, the face of someone who had learned to project authority without investing emotion in it, which was an efficient way to operate in a territory where the law's reach was frequently theoretical. He wore a coat better than Roland's, which Addie noted without significance. Men who needed to appear credible tended to spend money on visible things. The three of them stood at the edge of the hollow and looked down into what she had built. The weave of cedar above the excavated walls beginning to be lined with shale, the sleeping shelf visible at the rear, the drainage channel along the forward base. It looked like what it was, the beginning of a shelter, designed by someone who understood the specific problem they were solving. Cade Pruitt looked at it with the professional eye he had applied to structural problems for 20 years. He kicked a small amount of snow against the base of the nearest cedar support, watching how the structure received the contact. Marshal Ware's face tightened. A burrow fit for animals. His voice carried the dismissal lightly, the way men carried dismissals they considered self-evident. Heavy, wet snow will flatten that woven mess before January. Roland looked tired rather than angry. He looked like a man calculating a column of numbers that kept coming out the same way. Come back down before the first hard freeze closes the pass. You still have time. Addie was standing at the edge of the hollow with mud on her hands, and on the knees of her work pants, the shovel in her right hand, the broken auger in her left. She looked at Marshal Ware. When you come back in spring, Marshal, she said, I'll still be here. Not a challenge. An accounting of what she expected to be true. Marshal Ware stepped closer with the particular bearing of a man about to deploy authority he had been given by the territory of Wyoming. When the first real snowpack comes in, this place gets cleared. That's official. No one winters on this ridge without adequate. I own this ridge. Still level. Still without heat. The deed is in my coat. The silence that followed lasted long enough for wind to come through the cedar above them and pass on. Roland looked past her at the granite shoulder at the hollow at the cedar weave above it. He looked at the drainage channels in the floor, at the shale lining on the walls, at the sleeping shelf at the rear. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had spent 20 years in the timber business, someone who understood structural systems, whether he chose to acknowledge it or not. He was reading what she had built. Something moved in his expression, not quite respect, not quite reassignment, something that lived between the two and didn't have a clean name. "Father left you this land," he said finally very quietly. "I think he may have misjudged what you do with it." Then he turned. Cade Pruitt followed without a word. Marshall Ware stayed a moment longer looking at the shelter with his careful face, and in that extra moment, Addie saw something specific cross his expression, something that was not contempt and not admiration, but was closer to the look of a man quietly revising a prediction he had made in public. Then he followed the others back down the slope. The sound of their horses faded south. Addie stood in the hollow for a long time after the sound stopped, not because she was processing what had just happened, but because she was thinking about the split vent she hadn't built yet. The smoke problem was the next problem. The structural problem was largely solved. The cold problem was being solved. The smoke problem was the one that could kill her in ways the cold could not, because cold was visible. Cold announced itself. Cold gave time to respond. Bad air in an enclosed space did not announce itself at all. She spent 3 days on the vent system. Single pipe first. The obvious solution, the one that produced obviously insufficient results. The draft, inconsistent smoke backing in when the wind shifted direction outside. She watched the behavior of the smoke for 2 full days before she understood the dynamic. The wind outside the shelter created pressure differentials that reversed the draft when it shifted, pulling outside air down the vent pipe in gusts and pushing smoke back into the enclosed space. The solution came from watching the cedar canopy above her, the way the interlocked branches created multiple pathways for air rather than a single point of entry or exit. She split the vent pipe into 2 channels angled to each other, each opening positioned on a different face of the roofline. The pressure differential that reversed one channel could not reverse both simultaneously. The angles made that physically impossible. When she lit the fire in the finished configuration and watched the smoke for an hour, it rose cleanly through both channels in a thin, steady column, regardless of which direction the wind came from outside. She had been on the ridge for 31 days. November arrived and then deepened. The temperature stopped rising above freezing in the afternoons. The creek below the ridge went silent under gray ice. The light shifted to the flat, colorless quality that in this territory preceded serious weather by weeks rather than days. And the old men in Harlow's Crossing, she would learn this later, began checking barometers with the expressions of people who already knew what the barometers were going to say. The sod went on the roof in layers. She cut it from the hillside above in sections, carrying each piece on the broken shovel blade, laying it across the cedar weave, packing it tight. The weight added structural tension to the lattice below, pressing the woven cedar down against the supports, compressing the whole into a denser unit than it had been when it was only wood. She packed frozen moss into the gaps between sod sections, working across the roof in systematic passes until the morning she stepped back and looked and could not clearly see from 30 feet away where the slope ended and the roof began. The shelter had disappeared into the ridge. That evening, she sat by the fire with her hands wrapped around the tin mug of hot water she drank before sleep. No tea, no coffee. Those had run out weeks ago, and she thought about the coming months, the way she thought about problems she had not fully characterized yet. She knew what she had. She had mapped it carefully over 31 days. She did not know what she didn't know, which was the category of thing that killed people in places like this. She thought about Thomas asking her once, years before he got sick, what she was afraid of. She had told him the things I'm not smart enough to see coming. He had been quiet for a moment, then said that was probably the correct thing to be afraid of, and that the best response to it was to stay curious longer than made other people comfortable. She put another stick on the fire. The draft from the twin vent channels took the smoke straight up without hesitation. December settled onto Cutter's Ridge with a weight that was different from November in the way that serious intent was different from warning. The temperature dropped to ranges she measured not by the thermometer, which had stopped being useful at its lower limit, but by how fast water froze in the kettle when she moved it away from the fire, by how quickly her breath crystallized on the inside of the entrance tunnel when she checked the weather before dawn. The mountain had been preparing for this for months. So had she, though she wouldn't know until January whether she had prepared correctly. Silas Morrow returned to Cutter's Ridge in the 3rd week of December, moving through the frozen upper timber with the unhurried efficiency of someone on a familiar route. He crouched inside the shelter without speaking for a long time, running his eyes over the vent angles in the shale lining and the sod roof visible through the entrance tunnel. He lit a short candle he carried in his coat pocket and held it near the sleeping shelf near the drainage channel, near each vent opening in sequence. All three of them watched the flame steady at the shelf, undisturbed by cross-draft bending, cleanly toward each vent opening in the slight draw that the twin channels maintained even when the fire was low. Silas set the candle on the shale and looked at the ceiling. At the cedar weave holding the sod above them, the living branches still connected to their root systems, in the slope above the whole structure, continuous with the mountain it sat inside. "Most cabins fight the wind," he said. His eyes didn't move from the ceiling. "Yours lets it pass over." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the upper cedar with a sound that had changed quality in December, less cutting, more sustained, the sound of something that had settled in rather than passing through. "I've trapped 40 winters in these foothills," Silas said. "What's building to the north is different." He looked at her. Not with alarm. Silas Morrow was not a man who expressed alarm. With the specific attention of someone transferring information he considered important. The Crow didn't just use the snowpack for warmth. They let it seal the structure. They built the outside in, not the outside out. He rose. He paused at the tunnel entrance with one hand on the sod at the tunnel mouth and looked back at the twin vent channels. "Check those angles before it comes," he said. "Ice forms where the warm air meets the cold on the outside. If the channel's narrow, you'll know about it in the worst way." He left. Addie sat for a moment in the shelter's enclosed warmth. Fire low shale releasing heat. It had absorbed through the afternoon sod above, adding its own thermal weight, and understood that she had just been given the most important piece of information she had received since arriving on this ridge. She packed dried moss into every external seam she could reach. She built the drift fences she had been planning since the second week. Low woven structures of cedar branches set at angles to each other, 30 feet upslope from the hollow, designed not to stop the snow, but to redirect it to guide the drift where she wanted it to accumulate rather than where random wind would put it. She buried the cedar she had cut for fuel under a flat shale slab on the uphill side of the hollow. She checked the vent angles, then checked them again. The last days of December passed with the particular stillness that preceded serious systems in this territory. Geese that had already gone south in November. Horses in the valley below turning their backs to the north fence lines. The creek sound below the ridge changing pitch as ice thickened over it by increments. On the morning of January 3rd, the barometer in Harlow's Crossing, she would read about this later in the Wyoming Weekly Boomerang, which would devote considerable space to the winter of 1886 to 1887, dropped at a rate that made the trading post go quiet. On the night of January 5th, she did something she had not done in the 97 days she had been on Cutter's Ridge. The fire was banked, the entrance tunnel was blocked with the folded canvas. The shovel leaned against the wall where she could reach it in the dark. She sat on the sleeping shelf with her knees drawn up and took Thomas's handkerchief from the inside coat pocket, the left one, the one that had been his, and held it between both palms in the firelight. Not praying, not crying, just remembering the specific weight of his hands when he put them over hers, which he had done sometimes when she was working at something difficult, and wanted him to see she could manage it herself, but also wanted him there. The distinction had mattered to Thomas. He had understood it without being asked. She put the handkerchief back. The first gust hit Cutter's Ridge before dawn, like something that had been building momentum across 1,000 miles of open plain, and the mountain roared, and the cedar above the hollow bent hard to the southeast, and the sod on the roof compressed under the force of it, and the drift fences upslope caught the leading edge of the snowpack and began turning it exactly where she had calculated it would turn. She didn't build against the ridge. She buried herself inside it, and the ridge held. The storm did not peak on the first night. That was the first thing she learned about it. The first night was loud in a way that had no useful comparison. The cedar above the hollow sustaining a roar that made the previous months of wind sound like rehearsal. The granite cuts above finding harmonics that arrived at the shelter walls as something almost human, almost like a long continuous call across enormous distance. The sod on the roof compressed visibly under the force of it, the whole ceiling dropping perhaps an inch before stabilizing. The cedar weave below absorbing the load. the way it had been absorbing load since before Addie arrived on this ridge, distributing it through the network, no single point carrying more than the network asked of it. She slept in pieces. Between the pieces, she fed the fire, checked the vent channels by holding her palm near each opening and feeling for draw, confirmed the draw was present, went back to the shelf. The second day was when the cold became serious in a different register entirely. She understood serious cold in the abstract. Nebraska winters had given her the baseline, the kind that required extra wood and extra clothing, and produced a specific heaviness in the air that made outdoor work feel like moving through something with more resistance than air should have. What arrived on the second day of the January storm was different in the way that a river at flood was different from the same river in normal season. The temperature outside dropped below what her thermometer could measure, which meant below -30, which meant exposed skin failed in minutes rather than in the time it would take to notice the problem. She knew this not from going outside. She knew it from watching what happened to the small amount of moisture that collected near the entrance tunnel. It crystallized between 1 minute and the next. The phase change visible, the physics blunt and instructive. She kept the fire at the lowest useful level. Fuel conservation was arithmetic. She had calculated her wood supply for 3 weeks of normal winter use. This was not normal winter use, but the shelter's thermal mass, the shale walls, the earth floor, the compressed sod above, was working the way she had understood it would work, storing heat from the fire and releasing it gradually through the hours when the fire was low, so that the temperature inside fell slowly rather than immediately when the fire wasn't actively burning. She added wood in small increments rather than large ones. The fire never went high, it never went out. On the third day, the storm added wet snow to the wind. Wet snow was heavier than dry. She had built the drift fences upslope to manage exactly this, redirecting the accumulation over the hollow, rather than into it, letting the packed snow build a cap above the roof, rather than piling laterally against the walls. She measured the depth each morning through the vent channel, pressing a straight cedar stick through the opening until it hit the snow surface above, marking the depth with her thumbnail withdrawing the stick. 8 inches on the first morning, 19 on the second, 31 on the third. At 31 inches of packed wet snow above the cedar weave, the shelter became a different kind of quiet. Not the relative quiet of the cedar stand on that first night in October when the outside noise had been reduced to something manageable. This quiet was absolute in a way that had physical properties, a dampening of everything. The howling outside becoming a low, distant hum, like something heard through stone walls at the far end of a long corridor. The snow above was doing what snow at sufficient depth did, absorbing sound, absorbing the kinetic energy of the wind, acting as a buffer between the violence outside and the interior of whatever was underneath it. The crow had known this. Silas had known this. She had understood it theoretically from the drift lines and the hollow's geometry. Now she was living inside the proof. The butter she had bought in Harlow's Crossing in October, a small block wrapped in cloth kept near the entrance tunnel, because she hadn't expected it to last long enough to matter, was still soft. She discovered this on the third day when she reached for it. Soft enough to spread. The temperature inside the shelter had not reached the point at which butter froze solid, which was lower than the freezing point of water, which meant the thermal mass system was maintaining an interior environment above a threshold she had not been entirely certain she could hold. She held the butter block in her hand for a moment, looked at it, put it back. The fire crackled. The vent channels drew clean. The snow above pressed down and held. On the fourth day, she slept more than she had slept in 3 months. Not because the danger had passed, the storm was still audible, the distant hum of it, a constant background, but because the shelter was doing what it was built to do without requiring her constant intervention. She had built something that worked. In the absence of active crisis, the exhaustion of the previous 97 days settled onto her like a second blanket, and she let it. She dreamed about Thomas. Not a grief dream, not the kind she had been having since February, where he was present and then suddenly not, and the transition was the dream's entire content. In this dream, he was sitting at the workbench in her father's shop in Nebraska, fitting a mortise joint, his attention entirely on the wood. She was standing in the doorway watching him work. He looked up once, saw her, gave her the brief nod that meant he had registered her presence and was glad of it, then went back to the joint. She woke from it with a specific quality of feeling she had no clean word for. Not sadness, not exactly comfort. something particular to people who had loved someone for a long time and then lost them the way grief and gratitude eventually stopped being separate things and became a single compound weight that was somehow easier to carry than either one alone. On the morning of the fifth day she dug out, the entrance tunnel had narrowed to a crawl space under the accumulated drift. She worked through it with the shovel cutting blocks of compressed snow and pushing them back past her body into the shelter, then moving the blocks to the side to clear the channel. The snow was dense, came free in defined sections rather than crumbling, which meant she could move it in pieces rather than scoops. She worked without hurrying the same way she had worked at every problem on this ridge. When her head cleared the snow surface, the light hit her face with the specific brutality of February sun on fresh snowpack. She kept her eyes shut and let them adjust in degrees, opening them incrementally until she could see without the white burning into her vision. Then she looked at the valley. Harlow's crossing had nearly disappeared. She could see it from the ridge, the angle of the slope giving her a clear sightline down through the foothills to the flat ground where the town sat. She could see it now, but barely. The snowpack across the valley floor was unbroken white in every direction, drifts covering the fences, the roads, the structures up to their eave lines. She could make out shapes where barn rooftops and buildings pushed above the surface, but they were humps in the white undifferentiated, identifiable only because she knew what was under them. No smoke from any of them. Not one column rising from the valley floor. No smoke meant no functioning chimneys. No functioning chimneys meant frozen flue pipes or collapsed structures or fires that had gone out in the night and could not be relit in temperatures where the human body failed outdoors in minutes. She stood there and looked at the valley without smoke and understood in a way that she had not understood before this moment, despite having reasoned toward it many times what Roland had been giving her when he slid that deed across the table. He had been giving her the outcome he expected, the outcome the mountain was supposed to produce. She turned and looked at the ridge behind her, at the mound in the snow that was the shelter she had built, at the two thin, dark lines of the vent channels rising from the top of the mound in steady gray columns against the white sky, the draw still working, the fire still burning below. She had not conquered this mountain. The idea would have seemed absurd to her even if she'd been inclined toward it given what the mountain had done to her hands and her sleep and her supply of dry beans over 97 days. She had listened to it. She had read the drift lines and the moss growth and the geometry of the hollow and the way the cedar canopy distributed force, and she had built something that participated in what the mountain was already doing rather than trying to override it. The mountain had sealed it and insulated it and protected it the way it protected the things that worked within its logic. She stood on top of the mound in the wind, which had dropped to something manageable after 5 days of violence, and she did not feel triumph. She felt the specific quality of thing that came when you had been afraid for a long time, and the fear had not been resolved by some external event, but had simply been outlasted. Sat through. She had been afraid since October, since February. If she was honest, since the fever took Thomas and the world rearranged itself into a shape she hadn't been prepared for. She had been afraid in Roland's lawyer's office, afraid on the wagon up the ridge road, afraid every night the mountain found a new way to demonstrate how thin her margin was. The fear had not left. She had simply been too busy to let it stop her. She was still on the ridge. The butter was still soft. The valley had no smoke. She went back inside. She added wood to the fire. She measured the vent draw. She ate the last of the salt bacon and half the remaining beans because she had earned a full meal, and because rationing had a point of diminishing return when the person doing the rationing needed to be able to function. She was sitting on the sleeping shelf with the empty pan when she heard something outside the entrance tunnel. Not wind, not snow movement, not the structural sounds of the shelter working. Something biological, the specific irregular rhythm of a person moving through deep snow on hands and knees rather than upright on feet. She took the shovel from the wall and went to the tunnel entrance. Cade Pruitt was barely recognizable. His coat had torn open across the left shoulder, the wool hanging loose and useless on that side, and he was moving through the drift outside the tunnel with the slow mechanical quality of someone operating on body temperature rather than decision. Ice had formed in his beard and eyebrows, not frost, but actual ice, the kind that formed when the moisture and breath froze before it could clear the face. One side of his face had gone the gray-white of deep frostbite. His eyes, when he looked up at her, were narrow and fixed in the way eyes fixed when snow blindness was already working on them. He had followed the smoke from the vent channels. She understood this before he said anything because it was the only way anyone would have found the hollow from the valley in that visibility in those conditions. He had seen two thin gray columns rising from a ridge that should have had nothing rising from it, and he had walked toward them. She pulled him through the tunnel entrance by the shoulders of his ruined coat. He was heavier than expected, or she was more tired than she had accounted for, and they got tangled in the narrow passage for a moment before she found the angle that worked. Then he was inside on the floor of the shelter, in the warmth and the firelight. The warmth hit him visibly, moving through him, the way warmth moved through very cold things, slowly, unevenly, the body processing it in stages. He lay still with his eyes open and the ice in his beard melting in thin lines down his face. She put the pan on the fire with water and the remaining beans. She did not ask him anything. Whatever had happened would be apparent in time, and he was not capable of a useful conversation yet. She set the pan of beans near him when they were done close enough to reach without sitting up fully. She went back to the sleeping shelf. The small gesture required nothing from either of them and asked nothing in return. That was the point of it. When he could sit upright, she watched for the moment his core had absorbed enough warmth that voluntary movement was available again, the same quality of attention she applied to the shelter's systems. He put his back against the shale wall and looked at the ceiling. At the cedar weave, the sod pressing down on it, the two vent channels drawing clean in the upper corner. He looked at these things for a long time, the way a man looked at something he was trying to understand rather than something he was seeing for the first time. "The bunkhouse," he said finally. His voice carried the texture of someone who had been breathing cold air for a long time. Second night, the ridge beams went. She listened. Wet load. Then the stovepipe froze before we knew it was freezing. He stopped. The fire settled. Smoke backed up. She understood what came after without needing to hear it. She had fixed exactly that problem in a freezing rainstorm with bare hands on a different night, and she knew what happened when you didn't fix it in time. "The others," she said, a pause that told her most of what she needed to know. "Malone got down to the valley before the second night. The rest, I don't know about the rest." She didn't ask more. He ate the beans in the careful way of someone whose hands were not fully functional, and she watched without watching, the way you monitored something you were responsible for without making the monitoring a performance. When he set the pan down, he looked at the vent channels again, then the shale walls, then the sleeping shelf. "I kept cutting against the wind," he said, not to her specifically, to the space or to whatever version of himself had been laughing at the cedar weave in October. "Every structure I've put up in 20 years. Tallest walls you could build, biggest ridge beams, steepest pitch on the roof to shed the load." He looked at the compressed sod above them. The pitch just gave it more surface to push against. She didn't answer. He wasn't asking her to. She put another piece of cedar on the fire. The draw from the twin vent channels took the smoke straight up without hesitation. Outside, the storm was still present, still audible as a low, sustained note through the layers of earth and snow above them, but it had the quality now of something working at a distance rather than something overhead. The storm loosened its grip over the following days without announcing it was doing so, temperature rising by increments too small to feel individually, wind dropping from sustained to gusting, to occasional, the quality of the silence outside, shifting from the flat, absolute silence of serious cold to something with more texture, more movement. On the 8th day since the storm began, she dug the entrance tunnel fully clear and stood outside in the stillness of a Wyoming morning after a major system had moved through the air, holding the particular clean quality it had when it had been reorganized by weather and was settling into whatever it intended to be next. Cade Pruitt could walk. His hands were bandaged in strips from her spare shirt, the frostbite wrapped and protected, and he moved carefully but under his own management. He stood beside her outside the hollow entrance and looked at the mound, at the snow-covered sod and cedar, at the twin vent channels still pulling thin gray lines against the pale sky. He was quiet for a long time. Then how did this hold? Not quite a question. The kind of thing a person said when they had already worked out most of the answer, but needed to hear it from the person who built it. She thought about how to say it, about the ash in the tin, the drift lines in October snow, the cedar branches that bent instead of breaking the cold air, sinking to the drainage channel, while the sleeping shelf stayed above it. About Silas Morrow setting the shovel and broken auger on the frozen ground and walking away without explanation. The mountain already showed us how, she said. Her eyes moved to the entrance tunnel, to the sod above, to the way the structure had become indistinguishable from the ridge it sat inside. We were the only fools trying to build against it. He looked at the hollow for another moment. Then he looked at her. Not the look he had given her in October, the professional's dismissal of something assessed as temporary. A different look. The look of a man filing away information he intended to use. 3 weeks later, Silas Morrow came up Cutter's Ridge with 6 men behind him on snowshoes cut from ash wood and rawhide. They carried shovels, blankets, a narrow sled of the specific dimensions used to transport things that could no longer sit upright. Silas had told the men they were going to see what remained. He had told them this because it was the reasonable assumption, given what the January storm had done to Harlow's Crossing, 3 dead dozens of cattle. 7 barn roofs collapsed, and Silas was not a man who made unreasonable assumptions. He saw the smoke first. He stopped on the slope below the hollow. The men behind him stopped. Silas stood and looked at 2 thin gray columns rising steadily from a mound on the ridge above, and he looked at them long enough that the man directly behind him asked if something was wrong. "No," Silas said. He kept looking at the smoke. "Something's right." Addie was splitting cedar beside a chopping block she had carved from a section of frozen deadfall, working with the short, regular rhythm of someone doing a familiar task without urgency. She heard them coming and did not stop splitting. She had been working this particular round for 20 minutes and intended to finish it. The sound of the axe carried through the post-storm stillness across a considerable distance. Silas and the 6 men came over the last rise and stopped, and she felt their stillness from where she was standing before she looked up the specific quality of a group of people who had encountered something that required a revision of expectation. She set the axe in the round and looked at the sled, at its dimensions, at the men's faces. "Pruitt's inside," she said. "His hands aren't right yet. You'll need to make another trip." One of the men pulled his gloves off slowly, the way you pulled your gloves off when your hands needed to do something other than grip. Silas walked to the shelter mound and put his boot on the sod, testing it. He stood on it for a moment, his weight distributed across the compacted snow, the cedar weave, the living branches below, and looked down at the valley. Then he shook his head once in the private way of a man completing an internal argument that had been running for some time. 40 winners, he said. His voice was level, the voice of a man stating fact rather than performing feeling. I never saw snow used that way. Spring came to Cutter's Ridge the way spring came to high elevations in the Wyoming foothills, not as warmth first, but as sound. Water moving under snowbanks, ravens returning to the upper ridge, wind that pushed rather than cut. The first green shoots appeared in the cedar weave on the roof in late April. The living branches she had left rooted in the slope above, sending new growth through the lattice. She noticed them one morning while checking the roof for winter damage and stood there looking at them. Fine green needles pushing through the interlocked structure, the tree continuing to grow into and through the things she had built around its branches. The mountain had not dismantled the shelter, it had incorporated it. Harlan Dietz was the first person from Harlow's Crossing to make the climb after the road cleared. He had lost his barn in the January storm and 11 head of cattle, and he came up the ridge with the careful eyes of a man who had lost something significant and was trying to understand what might prevent it again. She showed him the drift, fencing how it was set at angles rather than in a straight line, how the gaps between sections were as important as the sections themselves, how the goal was to redirect the snow rather than stop it. He walked the fence line twice, looking at the angles without speaking. When he left, he carried the geometry behind his eyes, and she knew from the way he studied it that she would see it again in a different form on a different piece of land. Others came after him, some with notebooks, some with only questions. A woman from the southern edge of the valley whose husband had lost 3 fingers to frostbite in January came up in May and sat inside the shelter for an hour, asking about the sleeping shelf height and the drainage channel and the vent angles, and left with the practical knowledge of someone who intended to apply it directly. Cade Pruitt came in June, his hands healed enough to hold a pencil, and spent an afternoon sketching the twin vent channel angles for the new bunkhouse design his logging crew would use the following season. He drew carefully asked precise questions, did not refer to October or to January by any word or gesture. She answered his questions. That was the whole of it. No accounting for what had passed between them. No ceremony, just information moving from the person who had worked it out to the person who could use it, which was the only kind of reckoning that produced anything lasting. Marshal Denton Ware came in July with 2 members of the town council. He had not returned to the ridge after the October confrontation, not in November, when he declared he would not in December, not during the storm, not in its aftermath. He did not explain the absence. He looked at the shelter, at the drift fences, at the road that had formed naturally on the slope from all the spring foot traffic. He proposed, in the careful language of a man making a practical suggestion, rather than an admission that the path be formally designated Holt Ridge Road on the county survey. The council members agreed. Ware looked at Addie while they were agreeing. She looked back. The silence between them held everything that needed to be said and released both of them from saying it. Roland's man came in August, a young carpenter she recognized from the sawmill. Quiet, thorough, the kind of worker who understood that his job on this particular trip was to observe rather than to represent any position. He spent 2 days. He measured the drift fence angles and the vent channel geometry and the dimensions of the sleeping shelf relative to the drainage channel. He was polite, asked careful questions, was completely non-committal about what Roland might or might not do with what he was learning. She gave him coffee. He thanked her. He went back down the ridge. That autumn, Roland Holt's barn was the only structure in the Harlow's Crossing Valley with new drift walls built to specific angles on the north and west faces. No one mentioned this to Roland. No one mentioned it to Addie. The information had moved through the landscape the way useful information moved through practical communities, without announcement, without attribution, through the visible evidence of changed behavior. People in Harlow's Crossing eventually gave her a name, the way small communities gave names to things they needed to be able to refer to without explaining. The Ridge Binder, not for conquering the ridge, for binding herself to it, for what the shelter demonstrated about the relationship between a person and a landscape when the person was willing to listen long enough to understand what the landscape was already doing. The frontier didn't reward the loudest claim. It rewarded the one who listened long enough to understand the question. She was on the ridge the following October when the aspens went bare again, standing on the roof of the shelter, which now looked so completely like part of the hillside that visitors sometimes walked past it before understanding what they were looking at, checking the vent angles before the season changed. The valley below had smoke from every chimney. Some of the barns had new roof lines lower pitched than before. The drift walls were visible on several structures from this angle. The specific geometry of angled sections rather than straight lines. She ran her hand along the sod on the roof, under her palm through the compressed grass and the frozen earth. She could feel the faint warmth of the cedar weave below the living wood still connected to its roots, still growing, the structure built around something alive rather than over something cut down. Not warm the way a wall was warm. Warm the way the earth was warm at depth quietly in its own logic without asking to be acknowledged. She kept her hand there.